Hey guys, today on Big Al Books, I'm here today to talk about my honorable and dishonorable mentions for the books that I've read this year. I had such a hard time narrowing down my list of top 10 favorite books that I read this year, so I thought I'd make an extra video to shout out some books that I feel like deserve some recognition even though they didn't make my top 10 list, and I also thought it would be fun to cover some of my unfortunate reading encounters of the year. So this video is going to be split up into a few different parts. The first half will cover some fictional books that I liked but just weren't strong enough to make it on the top 10 list, and these are divided into groups of books that had wonderful plots, books that had great characters, and books that had a strong sense of setting and atmosphere. Then we'll talk a bit about some of the wonderful nonfiction books that I read this year, and then lastly we will get into the shady section where I talk about the books that I did not enjoy this year. So I hope you enjoy this format, and let's get started. Starting off with some books that had excellent plots, I feel like I had to mention a few of the Shakespearean plays that I read this year. One of them in particular I found really entertaining on a plot level, and that was Coriolanus. This is one of Shakespeare's lesser-known tragedies. It is set in Rome, and it's about a man who's really built his reputation on being a very ruthless but effective soldier, and then he gets into politics, and it turns out that he's very openly dismissive of the people, so he's just very rude to the people who are supposed to be voting for him. And this leads to some bad events occurring, and then he gets kicked out of the city and he wants to now fight Rome, and it's this whole mess. So for one thing, I thought it was a very interesting commentary on democracy and what does it mean when your leaders kind of like openly admit that they don't really care about their constituents. But it was also just fascinating. You never knew what this guy was going to do, if he was going to fly off the handle or what was going to happen. So I really enjoyed this one. And another Shakespeare play I feel like I have to mention is Titus Andronicus, another one of his tragedies. And I feel like this is a great play to read if you're someone who thinks that Shakespeare is really stuffy and fancy and academic, because this play is just ridiculous. It is a gore fest. So if you're someone who likes action movies, I mean, this is just over-the-top violence all the time in this play. And this book has such a fun plot twist when some of the characters are murdered and cut up and served into a pie, which is a hilarious move. So I really enjoyed the wild spectacle that was Titus Andronicus. I also had to mention Hagseed by Margaret Atwood, which is a reworking of Shakespeare's play The Tempest, and this was a very fun and very ridiculous reworking of a Shakespearean play, taking the themes of revenge from The Tempest. This is about a disgruntled man who's been fired from his job as a theater festival director. He ends up working at a prison, and he wants to teach Shakespeare to prisoners, and they end up putting on this production of The Tempest, which then serves as revenge to the people that fired him from his original job, and it's totally absurd, and you're watching it happen, and you know that it's ridiculous, but somehow I feel like Margaret Atwood really pulled it off, and I had so much fun reading this book. Next, I wanted to talk about two books that have really intense plots. These were books that I was so uncomfortable reading them the whole time because there's just so much suspense, and they're books that I had to burn through because I needed them to be over so that I could be free and start living my life again. So one of those books was definitely Passing by Nella Larsen. On the surface, it seems like it should be a nice story. It's about two childhood friends who reconnect again as adults by chance, and they're both African American women, but one of them has light enough skin that she has been passing in society as a white woman, and in fact her own husband doesn't even really know the truth about her race. And this book just kind of builds from there, and it seems like so high stakes because you're like, what's going to happen if people find out? And you also realize that there are all these layers of complications between these women and their friendship and their motives and what they want from each other, and it really builds up to a stunning finale. I think I read the majority of this book in a day because I just really was feeling so much anxiety that I needed this one to be done, even though I did love it very much. Another super intense book that I read this year was the historical fiction novel As Meat Loves Salt by Maria McCann. This is set in England in the 1640s, and first of all, it's a fun plot. lot because the main character, Jacob, just goes through so many different changes in station throughout his life. So he starts off this book as a servant. You think everything's good, he's about to get married, and then everything falls apart. He ends up in Cromwell's army, but then he also ends up making this friend and moving in with him, and they want to start a colony, and just there's so much going on in this book. So even though it's long, it just is always changing, so you never get bored. And secondly, this book is so intense on a plot level because this guy is getting in a love affair with his soldier friend from the army, and that's not really a thing that you can like openly get involved in this time period. So you're always just very like stressed out about the relationship. Not to mention that the main character also hears voices in his head. So there's also kind of that whole like unreliable narrator, strange themes going on. So this was a really wild read. And lastly, on a plot level, I just had to mention the complete collection of Bone by Jeff Smith. This is a cartoon epic, and this was just so fun that it's huge, but I read it all within a week while I was on March break. And what I like about this series is that it really changes in intensity. At first, it's just like the story of these three goofy cousins. They've been kicked out of their village, and then they're just trying to start anew, and they get involved in some schemes, and it's all fun and games. But then the series slowly starts escalating and shifting, and you realize that the stakes are so much higher than you could ever have expected, and it turns into this whole kind of like Lord of the Rings thing almost. So it gets really intense by the end of the book. So it was really cool to watch the series grow, and I really enjoyed every minute of this one. Moving on to some books that had very memorable characters, I have one last Shakespearean play to talk about, and that was Henry IV Part 1, because this play introduced me to Falstaff, who is now one of my favorite Shakespearean plays. Sometimes I like to joke that my philosophy about life is that I'm just here to have a laugh, and I feel like Falstaff really embodies that philosophy, you know? He's just like living his best life. He really doesn't care too much about serious things. He just wants to drink a lot and make a lot of jokes, and he was just so much fun to watch, even though he is kind of this like dirty old guy. And basically he serves as this bad influence who has been corrupting young Prince Hal, and the prince himself was kind of a fascinating character to watch in this play because his dad thinks that he's a screw-up, but he keeps saying that I'm only pretending to be bad so that it will look really good when I do mature and get serious. So like it was always interesting to try to see his transformation, but really Falstaff was so much fun and he had me laughing a lot. So I really appreciated making his acquaintance in this play. He does show up in a few other plays, but it's just not as much fun as this one. I was also able to reread 2 books this year that contain some of my favorite characters. One of them I have to mention, Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery, which is a book that I didn't know that I loved until I reread it again as an adult. And I of course loved spending time with Anne Shirley. She is not one of those like annoying, plucky orphans because so much of what she says is just like random or ridiculous. So there were so many great quotes that I got from reading this book. And I also grew to care deeply about Anne's caretakers, Matthew and Marilla Cuthbert. Another book I reread was A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole. This is a comedic novel set in New Orleans and is totally worth reading for the ridiculous protagonist, Ignatius J. Riley. You know, he's a bit of a mess of a human being. He is unemployed and he's living with his mom and he's not able to hold a job and he's always railing against society. He is a medieval scholar, so he thinks that the modern world is absolutely crazy, but he has so much dignity and he's such a deeply pretentious person that he was so much fun to read about because even though he is pathetic, he never accepts that. He is always trying to fight against the wheel of fortune turning against him, and it was just so much fun to encounter him again. I also wanted to mention Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This had such a great portrayal of a woman named Ifemelu who grows up in Nigeria and ends up moving over to America, and it's all about the difficulties of this transition for her. And what I liked about this character was that she could be very funny and sarcastic. She writes this blog about race that makes a lot of witty jabs, but at the same time it was a very sensitive portrayal that also allowed you to feel a lot for the character. So I was always invested in Ifumelu's story, and I just really was rooting for her throughout this whole book. So this was just one of the most enjoyable reads that I read this year. Another remarkable character portrayal that I read this year was Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. It's about a First Nations man named Teo who is just coming back from fighting overseas in World War II. He returns to his reservation in New Mexico, I believe, and he's finding that people are no longer respecting him, but rather he's being quite discriminated against. And it's about his recovery as a human being. It's really his spiritual journey. When you start the novel, he is so sick and he's dealing with so much pain. He's got these memories of the past. He's got his trauma from the war, and it's really a lot. And he starts going on a spiritual recovery throughout this novel that is really beautiful to witness, and it has nothing to do with traditional Western medicine or therapies. And like with Americanah, I just really wanted the best for him, so this was just a fascinating and beautiful novel. A novel that had a fantastic cast of characters was The Odd Women by George Gissing. This is from the Victorian period, but it's about women who are fighting for women's rights and basically want women to be trained and educated and out in the workforce. So it was a cool novel on that front, but it just introduced you to so many different women, so you could see how different their lives were, and you could realize why it was very important for these women to be able to find work and to support themselves. Because there is one particularly disastrous relationship depicted in this novel where a girl gets married because she thinks that that's the right thing to do, and it is a total mess, and then she starts to fall for someone else, and that's even more of a mess. And I found myself caring so deeply for this girl. Like, I was so hurt with what was happening to her. So that's when I know there's great characterization. But there were just so many different women in this story. You know, there was one woman who was an alcoholic, and you don't see a lot of female alcoholics from this time period. And then there were other women that were like really tough. One of them had given her life to this women's rights movement, but then she started to fall in love for a guy, and she wonders if she's a hypocrite if she ends up marrying this guy. So there's a lot happening in this book, but I really loved getting to know all of these women, and even the male characters as well were fun, and it was just great to see how they would all interact with each other and cause some drama. And lastly, I wanted to mention the Saga series by Brian K. Vaughn and Fiona Staples. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to put this into plot because this is a really fun intergalactic story. There is a war going on in this universe, but really I think what makes me so invested in this series are the characters. It is ultimately a story about a family who is just trying to make it work in some very trying times, and I always love books about dysfunctional families, but I've never seen a dysfunctional family saga play out like it has in this series. So it's really cool taking those interpersonal relationships that I'm so interested in reading about and having it play out in such a fantastical setting. So that's been a really wonderful reading experience for me. My last category for fiction is books that have a strong sense of setting and atmosphere. So I have two books that were both set in Harlem that captivated me for very different reasons. One of them was A Rage in Harlem by Chester Himes. Now this is a very absurd and sensationalized portrayal of Harlem, since Chester Himes actually had literary ambitions and he was writing this in Paris, but his readers really just wanted sensationalized depictions of the violence and seedy crime scenes in Harlem, so he delivered with this book. It is absurd and over the top, but it was so much fun to read about. And then another book set in Harlem was If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin, and this one is kind of the opposite of Chester Himes. This one is just like achingly beautiful. It's about a young couple who fall in love but can't be together because of circumstances and, you know, society. So it's a very tragic novel, but it is such a beautiful and intimate glimpse of what Harlem was like in this time period. The next few books that I have to talk about all have a very creepy energy or sense of atmosphere. One of them is a collection of short stories called The Doll's Alphabet by Camilla Gradova, and the setting was really unusual in this book in that you couldn't quite place your finger on where these stories were happening or what time period, so I thought that was really imaginative. And these stories kind of have this like magical realism vibe, but it's not like quirky or charming. So if you're someone that you think you maybe don't like magical realism because it's so quirky and annoying, then you might want to try these stories, because anything unusual that happens in them leaves you feeling a lot more ominous or unsettling. So I quite enjoyed that about these stories. Another creepy short story collection I read this year was Things We Lost in the Fire by Mariana Enriquez. These are translated from Spanish, and they're Gothic stories set in Buenos Aires. So if you're looking for like a different take on Gothic fiction, you know, something that's not in an old walled up castle in Europe, then these stories are really cool, taking this sense of dread and unease and putting it in this urban situation. These stories were very unique and haunting. I also had to mention Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin, who I believe is from Buenos Aires, so another South American writer who is just doing such creepy things with her fiction. This book is so unsettling. I can't even begin to unpack it in this video, but basically I read it in one sitting, and that's kind of the way you have to play it with this one. You just have to let the story suck you in and unfold, and I found it so successful because it's one of those books that you don't really know if there's something supernatural happening or if it's just real world elements that are so terrible that it's causing what's happening. This is a majorly unsettling novel, but I think it's brilliantly constructed. How Schweblin chooses to tell this story really sucks you in and you can't put it down even though you really want to. My last read of 2018 was this one, Vita Nostra by Marina and Sergei Jachenko. So this was translated from Russian, and this was another book that just like had such a unique atmosphere that I found it really hard to put down. And it's kind of a book that seems like it's set in a mundane world and then fantastical things start happening, but it's not a book that's like joyous about magic. Everything is so like confusing and ominous, and I thought the atmosphere in this book was brilliant. So this was quite a spellbinding and mind-bending read for sure. Moving on into some of the best nonfiction books that I read this year, let's start off with some memoirs. I had to read about 10 or so memoirs for this grade 10 English class that I was teaching this year, and I realized while doing so that memoir is really not my preferred genre of nonfiction. I don't know, there's something that just doesn't always click with me, but there were two memoirs that really stood out to me, and one of them I feel like should not even be included on a list of nonfiction because there were so many lies and ridiculous events in this book, but that was My Life by Benvenuto Cellini, who is an Italian artist that lived in the Renaissance. So this was fascinating to learn about some art history from the perspective of a man who is totally unstable and gets involved in a lot of fights and murders and drama. He's fighting with the Pope, he's fighting with his patrons, he's fighting with his rival artists. There was just so much going on in this book. Seriously, it is insane. And it was the most fun I've ever had reading a memoir. The other memoir that I enjoyed for very different reasons was Into Thin Air by Jon Krakauer. This is about an ill-fated journey to Mount Everest, where a lot of the people that he was climbing with encountered some bad weather and ended up dying. So it's kind of his reflections on being involved in this tragedy, trying to work out what went wrong. There's some survivor's guilt at play here, how he felt he could have handled the situation differently. So it was quite an engaging way to read about what the experience of climbing Everest is like. And I realized while reading this book that there are two types of people in the world: those who read a book like this and think, I am never going to climb Mount Everest, and people who read this book and be like, yeah, I think I could handle it, bring it on. I am definitely of the never want to climb a mountain camp, especially after reading about this disaster. The only fantastic biography that I read this year was actually quite a bizarre biography, and that was The Incantations of Daniel Johnson. This is about an indie singer-songwriter, and it is just like the most bizarre depiction of a life, saturated in so much color. You know, it's not the kind of a linear story that you're going to expect, but I really liked that, experimenting with a person's life and not trying to squeeze it into some kind of narrative, but rather trying to depict something that is a bit wilder, but perhaps more honest. So this was just fascinating as a form, and I really felt that it was true to its subject. My next genre for nonfiction involves some eloquent essays, and clearly this is the genre that I am the most passionate about with nonfiction. I like hearing authors reflect on their life and their own experience, but I don't necessarily need them to do that in the narrative of a memoir, but I'd rather have these random moments here and there that you can pepper throughout in an essay collection. One of the most charming essay collections I've ever read is Ex Libris by Anne Fadiman, and this is just what it's like to be a book lover, and Anne is very passionate, but these essays were just very witty and enjoyable and very relatable if you too are a bookworm. Another essay collection I loved was They Can't Kill Us Until They Kill Us by Hanif Abdurraqib. This is a collection of music criticism, but the way that Hanif writes about music is so vital and urgent, and he connects it to so many of his own personal experiences that it was just a joy to read about his thoughts on music, and he also gets into quite a few essays about race in America. I also quite enjoyed this slim little essay, The Hatred of Poetry by Ben Lerner. He is investigating why people have so many strong feelings of hatred when it comes to the subject of poetry, why poetry might potentially be a failure of a medium, and he involves some really great examples of bad poems. I also loved reading I Am Woman, a native perspective on sociology and feminism by Lee Maracle. I usually enjoy anything that Lee Maracle writes. I think she is just such a wise woman, and this book was very creative for nonfiction. It's not just straight up essays. She doesn't just recount her own experiences, but there were some poems in here. There were scenes where she would reflect on a conversation that she had 20 years ago and compare what she said in the moment to what she might say now. So this was just a very creative collection that had a lot of remarkable insights in it. And I also greatly enjoyed this collection of essays by Philip Pullman. It's called Demon Voices, and most of these essays are based around the idea of storytelling. So it was great to see a master craftsman share his thoughts on how he puts together stories or how he sees stories all around him playing out in real life or in the paintings that he sees. It was just a really fascinating and fun collection to read. Two nonfiction books that I really loved this year served as informative introductions to new topics for me. One of them was Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which itself is a graphic text that teaches you all about comics, how they function, and why they matter. I also loved At the Existentialist Cafe, Freedom Being an Apricot Cocktails by Sarah Bakewell. This served as a very smooth and accessible entry point into the world of existentialist philosophy. So I really appreciate the way that Sarah Bakewell was able to provide these concise explanations of some pretty dense topics, and now I'm feeling ready to take on some of these works in their original form after reading this handy intro book. And lastly, I have two favorite nonfiction books from this year. One of them is called As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance by Leanne Bedesemasake Simpson. So if you're someone that is interested in the topic of Indigenous resistance, if you're interested in like the Standing Rock protests, then this book is essential. It talks about how this tradition of resistance is deeply rooted in a lot of Indigenous culture and history, and how it's going to play a very essential role in the future. And of course, I have to mention The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. This is a brilliant work that explores what it means to be a woman in the world, and though it is a bit dated now, a lot of what Simone says still rings true. She writes about imbalances and power dynamics between the sexes, and she writes in detail about every stage of a woman's life, so it's very fascinating. Especially if you do identify as female, you might see some of your experiences mirrored in this text, or if you are looking to learn a bit more about the subject, then this was a really valuable read. And now for my list of the 5 worst books that I read this year, we're going to start off with The Honey Farm by Harriet Alida Lai. I really wanted to like this one. There is something that's very creepy about bees, so I was interested to see what this creepy novel set on a bee farm was going to be like, but ultimately the characters were just really flat and I could not be bothered to care about them. And this whole novel is like a slow burn, which is fine if it builds to something exciting, but this never did. It just kind of fizzles out, so this was kind of just a waste of time. Next up is a beloved children's classic, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz by Frank Baum. This just did not add anything to me. I feel like the film version is just so superior that reading the original it seemed to pale in comparison. I think a lot of the emotional depth to the characters and their motivations was added in the film, and it just felt like everything was flat once it was missing in the books. Also, there were a few scenes in the book that were cut from the movie, and you can see why, because they were just really boring to read about. The writing wasn't anything fancy. I mean, I guess it's children's lit, but it was just a very simple sentences with basic vocabulary, so there wasn't a lot of joy in describing this world. And also, the kiss of death was that I listened to this really annoying, chipper audiobook narrator who just was like way too cheery. That really did not help me get into the story, so this one just did not work for me at all. Moving into the Hall of Shame, we have my 1-star reads of the year. This one was Gods Behaving Badly by Marie Phillips. This takes the Greek gods and puts them in contemporary modern day London, and it's supposed to be like a zany comedy about all the mischief that they get into, and it just completely fell flat for me. Part of that to me was because the characterization of the gods just seemed like so obvious and basic. It wasn't a very nuanced portrayal of the god. I just thought there was a lot of cheap and easy jokes made here. Also, the humor in this book really never landed with me at any point, so that kind of made the reading experience frustrating. And lastly, the plot was really predictable. So you kind of knew where the book was going the whole time, and I wasn't enjoying it at any point, and it's one that I really wish that I DNF'd because I did not get anything out of finishing this book. Next up is Shelter in Place by Alexander Maxick. This is a book that had a really great opening line and that just completely fell apart from there. The main character of this novel is a guy who is completely insufferable, both in the scenes from the past and the present. He's very ponderous and pretentious, and he looks out his window looking at the nature, and he asks himself lots of rhetorical questions, and I just didn't care about his story at any point. He also falls in love with a manic pixie dream girl, which is always like so irritating, and his mother is supposed to be framed as this feminist icon because she beat a man to death with a hammer, which is like maybe not the most heroic act. Like, it was just like a very weird interpretation of feminism that I just did not like. And also there was a really shallow depiction of mental illness, so just nothing in this book worked for me. Even its setting, it is set in Washington State during the 90s, which should be great, and yet it somehow just nothing was good. So this was my biggest fictional flop of the year. I just could not with this book. And lastly, my worst read of the year and of probably my life was Seriously, I'm Kidding by Ellen DeGeneres. And now celebrity memoirs are usually not a go-to genre for me, but this was one of the books that I had to read for that grade 10 English class. So I had to read it, but I was going in feeling optimistic. I was like, Ellen DeGeneres has probably had an interesting life. I'll probably learn something more about her, but no, that did not happen because this is not really a memoir. It is some kind of like weird collection of like half-baked jokes alongside some very like surface level self-help motivational pieces, and there doesn't seem to be any common thread or narrative tying it all together. It was just really random, and the humor just never worked for me in this one. And ultimately, this book just made me really sad because I realized that a lot of Ellen DeGeneres fans are going to go out there and they're going to buy this book, and maybe some of them are even going to enjoy it. But I just felt bad because I feel like Ellen DeGeneres put like zero effort into this book. Like, she really could not have tried. This is something you could come up with in half an hour, just thinking any random thought that comes into your head. So that ultimately was just really sad to me. So even though I had low expectations for the writing style of this celebrity memoir, I at least thought that there would be like some content at the core of this book, and that was just missing. This just seemed empty, and it was a complete waste of my time. So that was my biggest fail of the year for sure. So that's it for my list of honorable and dishonorable mentions for the books that I read in 2018. Please let me know if you have any thoughts on these books, and I will see you again real soon for the best of the best when we talk about my favorite reads of 2018. Hope to see you there. Thanks for watching.